I'll start again. Thank you. Okay. I was saying welcome back. And it's good to see so many people. And I was just giving a little overview of what we're going to do today. So John and Nicole are going to begin by, doing the usual mindfulness practice and reminders and stuff like that. But then they're going to wrap up. So we're going to be finishing the DBT workbook, this last part of it, and they're going to go over that fairly quickly because we're moving on to internal family systems. But the next two sessions, so 22 today and 23 next week, we're not getting into the workbook yet. It's more of an overview just to give you an introduction to IFS and why we're doing IFS. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But before we do that, the second part of today is we're going to talk about the 4 pillars of recovery from trauma. We already talked about the 3 stages, and the 4 pillars and 3 stages are related, but it's kind of the prerequisites for the things you need to be doing to be able to recover from trauma, which they're all incorporated into the course. So without further ado, I think we've got everything functioning, recording, and it's like sharing the slides and all that. So Joan and Nicole. And oh yeah, we have a new co-leader for the last part of the course, but I'm going to introduce them when we start the IFS section. All right, thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome back.
Are you having trouble?
Already, yes.
Yeah.
It won't turn the page.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, everyone.
It's so if that happens, I think you just have to
Do the
press here.
Oh,
What did I do there? No, I obviously did the wrong thing. Okay. All right, and there, okay.
Thank you. Okay, so as Dr. Clado said, today we're wrapping up DBT. Nicole and I are going to move through our portion very quickly, like in about 20 minutes, we hope, because there is quite a bit of material to cover for the introduction for IFS today. So I won't go review these particular slides. It's just reviewing what we're doing and where we are in the at this point in our schedule. We're at week 22. And that's our practice session. There'll be a preparation next week, and then the next practice session will be for April week 24, April 8th. So we're going to do our meditation practice as we begin. And as always, let's check in with our personal dashboard. Let's take a few minutes by asking ourselves first, what is the current risk that I'll experience? A state of crisis. Are you low? Are you moderate? Are you high, very high, or extreme? We kind of use that fire danger illustration to illustrate that. And then ask yourself, am I in the window of tolerance? Yes, hopefully. Maybe you're a little bit outside, or maybe you're very outside. Then next, check in with your energy tank right now. Are you full, had a good sleep, and you're feeling energized? Maybe 3/4, half, or near empty. And then have you been rating your targets and tracking them every week? So check in with your Holes diary card. And how would you rate your targets right now? And finally, check in with your attention meter. How focused are you in the moment? Are you ready to go here, or are you a little bit sluggish and need to pay more attention? So our 5-minute meditation today is titled Changing Maps on the Journey. So let's begin by taking a moment to settle. Sit comfortably and let your feet rest on the floor, your hands on your lap. If it feels comfortable, allow your eyes to close or simply soften your gaze. Take a slow breath in and a long breath out. Again, breathe in gently and let the breath leave your body slowly. Allow your shoulders to drop a little. Let the muscles of your face soften. Just notice that you are here. Now imagine that you have been walking on a long journey. Along the way, you have been using a very helpful map. This map has helped you navigate difficult terrain, strong emotions, stressful situations, painful memories. This map has given you practical tools: how to pause, how to regulate emotions, how to ride the waves of distress without being overwhelmed. You might think of this map as the one we have been studying together, the map of dialectical behavior therapy. Take a moment to silently acknowledge the usefulness of this map. Perhaps noticing one skill or idea that has been helpful for you. Just hold that sense of appreciation for a moment. Now imagine that you arrive at a quiet place on the path. You pause. You gently fold up the map you have been using. You don't throw it away. You keep it with you. It is still part of your journey. But now you are about to open another map. This new map does not replace the first one. Instead, it shows you something different. It begins to reveal the inner landscape. Mountains and valleys inside you. Different voices, emotions, and parts of yourself that have been trying to help you survive. As you imagine opening this new map, see if you can feel a sense of curiosity, not judgment, not pressure, just curiosity about the inner world. Now gently bring your attention inward. Notice that within you there are different feelings, different impulses, different perspectives. Perhaps one part of you feels hopeful about exploring this. Another part might feel skeptical or cautious. All of those responses are welcomed. Just notice that the mind is not a single voice. It's more like a community of parts. And beneath those parts, see if you can sense a deeper place inside you. A place that can observe, a place that can be curious, a place that can listen with calm and compassion. Internal family systems. This deeper place is called self. For a moment, simply rest in that observing awareness. Now take one more slow breath. As you breathe in imagine stepping forward on your journey. You still carry the tools you have learned, and now you are opening a new map, one that will help you explore your inner world with curiosity and compassion. When you're ready, gently bring your attention back to the room and open your eyes.
Okay. Homework from last week. So of course, we encourage you to continue to submit your questions or comments to itsimple2023@gmail.com. Read skills training workbook, page 242 to 265. Continue to use all your tools and crisis plans, etc. And continue to track all the skills you've learned. Homework habits checklist. So I won't go through that, but certainly you can kind of go back to the slides if you need some help with trying to practice your homework, as well as the reminder participant agreement. So I won't go through that as well. So please make sure you have the Internal Family Systems workbook. So we'll be starting to use this workbook in session 24 on April 8th. So there's the picture of it if you're kind of looking online to see what it looks like, by Richard Schwartz. Oh my gosh, so this is the DBT wrap up. Can you believe we've almost finished the whole book? Yay! And then this is our updated personal skills list, all the distress tolerance skills we've done, all the mindfulness skills we've done, emotion regulation skills, and of course, we're going to finish up on interpersonal effectiveness skills today.
Yes. Yes, and as we said earlier, we have to go through the material quickly today in order to get to the IFS introduction. But Nicole and I do plan on doing an interactive activity at a future session when we have more time. So we look forward to sharing that with you. So we're going to talk about, we're not sure if there's 5 or 6 areas here because there's a number missing on exposure-based cognitive rehearsal. But we are going to wrap up interpersonal effectiveness skills today. These are more advanced interpersonal effectiveness skills. If you recall in previous sessions, we did the basic interpersonal skills. So today we're going to talk about more advanced interpersonal skills, starting with dealing with resistance and conflict. Oh my goodness. I think all of us can agree this is the most challenging part of dealing with relationships is conflict and those challenging conversations. And just to reassure you, session 30, we will spend a whole session, and Dr. Clay will put here 4 hours if you're willing, on challenging relationships, because there's an overlap between the material we cover in the green DBT workbook and what we're introducing with the IFS and seeing it through the IFS perspective. So this will be something I think all of us will find really, really helpful. We all find dealing with conflict is so hard. I think we can all agree with that. And conflict can trigger the brain's, fight, flight, or freeze response system, even in those small disagreements that we encounter in relationships. And conflict is hard because when our emotions go up, our ability to think clearly and act appropriately goes down. So it's really, really important to learn how to deal with some of these conflicts. There's lots of obstacles. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those obstacles, but I will highlight a couple that prevent us from dealing with conflict. I love the illustration with Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner there. There was always conflict, and it always seemed like the Roadrunner came on top. I always felt sorry for the coyote. If you ever seen those cartoons, you think, oh, could he just win once? No, but he never did. He never did. Anyways, some of those barriers or obstacles that prevent us from in those dealing in challenging relationships. One is passive habits. That's me. Sometimes we shut down to avoid conflict. Oh, I'll avoid conflict at all costs if I could. But the problem is long term, you will hold resentment and it's not healthy for you. So it's really important to develop some healthy skills to help you overcome these conflicts. Another one is aggressive habits. Maybe you're too aggressive in the way you communicate things, where you put psychological pressure on others. That's not healthy either. There's lots of examples in the green workbook that we encourage you to review. They're on this slide here. We encourage you to go back and review when you in your own time. I'm not going to read over those today just because of time, but we do encourage you to go back on and look at those yourself. Other obstacles are overwhelming emotions. Hey, you know, if you're tired and already feeling stressed, it's maybe not a good time to deal with a challenging conversation, right? Because we're already in a heightened state. Number 4, failure to identify needs. Maybe your communication skills fail when you can't clearly express what you want, okay? Fear can push us into using aggressive or aversive communication strategies. Certainly toxic relationships can make it difficult for us to communicate because we fear and we shut down. And 7, myths are those core beliefs that we hold about relationships. Maybe you were taught it's not right to say no. It's disrespectful. You should always do what you're told, and it's never right to speak up and express what you need. So what do you do? So if you're using all the skills we've talked about in the previous sessions, remember we talked about how to say no, the shoulds or I want statements or I prefer statements, open communication, active listening, all of those kind of basic interpersonal skills. If you're finding that they are not helping with those challenging relationships, there are some other things that we can recommend. So in these cases, maybe you're doing your part. You're trying really hard. Maybe at that point you look and say, maybe it's not me, it's the other person, right? So how do you deal with someone who is not using skills to help with communication? Well, there's one skill called mutual validation. No, so when people aren't listening to you, one of the most common reasons is they feel invalidated or they don't feel heard. So they keep pouring on the arguments and assertiveness. You can, if that's happening to you, you can short circuit that situation with mutual validation. Now remember, this does not mean you are agreeing with what the other person is saying. It simply acknowledges their point of view while also validating your point of view. So let me give you a little example. Something like what we encourage you to use, start your statement with, I understand. Just remember that, I understand. I understand that it's hard to hear that you're not pulling your weight around the house. It would hurt me too. But I'm worried things won't get done if I'm just doing it myself. See the difference? Some mutual validation. So just start your statement with, I understand. It will calm the situation down, validate some, but you're still getting your point across. That's mutual validation. Broken record. If I can just reword that a bit, we call this the calm broken record. So just staying calm, don't argue, don't debate, and don't answer wide questions. Stick to what you are concerned about in your communication. For an example, if your neighbor has a big tree and has a large branch that overhangs your house, and you're worried that the branch is going to fall down and crash on their roof, on your roof, you have to go and talk to the neighbor. So you knock on the door, you say, hi neighbor, that tree of yours has a big branch that overhangs my house and I'm worried that it's going to fall off and damage my roof. Your neighbor says, oh, it's been like that for years and nothing has happened. You could stay that calm, broken record. I am really worried with the storms we've been having that the branch will break at some point and damage my roof. Can we get an arborist in to check and make sure it's safe? See that? You get your point across, you stay the course. Right? Just keep coming back to you. I would like the roof checked or the tree checked. Probing asks the person what it is about what we have said that bothers them. And you keep probing until you get something that is useful. So let's look at the example of not pulling your weight. Only imagine this time you're the person being criticized in that way. Here's how probing could help. Your boss says to you, you're not pulling your weight around here. You say, what is it about my work that bothers you? The boss says, well, sometimes you leave early and someone else has to finish your work, and often that's me. Oh, what would you like me to do? You could say. I would appreciate if you could stay a little bit longer to ensure the work is done. And then you can respond saying, I appreciate you explaining that to me. So you probe until you get something that is useful. Another technique is called clouding. Clouding is all about agreeing with part of what is being said without accepting everything. This will often calm the other person down and stops that win-lose battle that often happens in arguments. So one way to agree is to modify words that are sort of the over-the-top exaggeration, like always and never, like those statements, you always do this or you never do that. Modifying that a bit. So for an example, someone says, you always get pissed off over little things. You could say, yeah, it's true. Sometimes I do get upset. Okay. Another example is, you never support me when I need something. Your response could be, yeah, it's true. There are times I couldn't support you completely, what you were asking. Notice how clouding steals the critic's thunder. And when that happens, it opens the door to real negotiation. Just calms the situation down. And finally, assertive delay. If anything in doubt, it's okay to say, I need a bit of time. Just simply say, what you said to me is important, and I need time to think about it. Or give me a minute, or I'll get back to you in an hour. I just got to think about that, and I'll get back to you. It's okay to pause and regroup and think about what you're going to say before you respond.
Okay, number 2, how to negotiate. So in negotiating, assume that each party has valid needs. So this is an acronym that you can try. The first part, it's called RAVEN. First for R is relax, accept conflict calmly. Take a deep breath before you say the next thing. A, avoid the adversive. So that is something you strongly want to avoid because it feels uncomfortable or upsetting. Try and stay positive. Hard to do with somebody who's really difficult, who's giving you a lot of negative feedback when you're trying to talk to them, but try and stay positive. V, validate the other person's needs and concerns, like Joan was talking about. So try to focus on fair, mutually agreeable outcome where both people can get some of their needs met. E is examine your values. So how do you want to be treated, or maybe how you want to treat others? And use a neutral voice. Hard to do when you're emotional and somebody's trying to, kind of, I call it, say, push your buttons, how not to respond that way, but try to stay in a neutral voice. Try to avoid anger and contempt in your tone of voice if you can. So we can't, like Joan said, due to time, we have to keep moving here. But if you want a step-by-step instruction on how to do RAVEN, please go back to the slides here and review on your own time.
Okay. I love that image there. We were laughing yesterday, Nicole and I, because she has blonde hair, I have dark hair. I am the brunette and Nicole is the me in that picture. So if despite using assertiveness skills and the strategies to deal with resistance, as we discussed, and we still do not feel heard, we might try to figure out what went wrong in the conversation. So the workbook on pages 249 to 251 give an effectiveness checklist that you can look at. And the key is to learn from what happened and use that to polish your skills. And remember, no setback is completely negative if it helps you to be more effective next time. So if we take a look at a few of those points, like perhaps were you clear about your goals? Right? Did we run into blocks into listening? Was there a negotiation breakdown? Things like that. And the thing here is the checklist is just simply a starting point to evaluate interactions that you wish could have gone better. Just focus on a few changes that might lead to big improvements. Write them down specifically what you're going to do differently in that situation in the future. And practice in your imagination using that editing, splicing, and pasting technique. So for an example, if I had an argument with my husband, maybe my tone got too intense and things, we didn't talk to each other for a little bit after that, I would maybe reflect on that situation and write down, next time I will use a softer tone and listen more attentively to what he is trying to communicate. But use that editing, splicing, and pasting technique. And the most important thing to remember about your new interpersonal skills is to keep working on them. Your persistence, we promise, your persistence will benefit you in the long term. Shrug off when things don't go right. That's okay. Things happen. It is what it is. And then figure out what happened and make a new plan. You have the ability to change your relationships. All you have to do is keep trying, and that's all we can ask of everybody.
Okay. Exposure-based cognitive rehearsal. So that's on page 253 of that green workbook. So this section of the workbook describes practical ways of practicing, rehearsing, and using the DBT skills, state-dependent learning, and practicing cognitive skills. So state-dependent learning, so this is on page 253, is a psychological concept that suggests that memory and recall are influenced by the internal state of an individual at the time of learning and at the time of recall. This theory proposes that information is best recalled when the individual's internal state, such as mood, emotions, or physiological states at the time of learning, matches their internal state at the time of their recall. In other words, if a person learns something in a particular state, like you're happy, maybe you're a little anxious, maybe you're a little bit more on alert, they're more likely to remember and recall that information when they're in that similar state later on. So state-dependent learning theory highlights the importance of considering the context and conditions under which learning takes place, as they can impact memory retrieval. So the state that you're in while you're learning can affect how well you remember later. Learning a relaxation skill while you're sitting quietly and you're in rational, calm mind, it will come to your mind more easily when you're in that similar state later on. So exposure-based cognitive rehearsal is a way of accounting for effects of state-dependent learning as we learn and practice DBT skills. It's a coping practice where a person imagines or rehearses a feared situation while using helpful, balanced self-talk so the situation feels less overwhelming over time. When using the editing, splicing, and pasting technique and pendulating, we are doing exposure-based cognitive learning. Editing, splicing, and pasting give us a chance to practice our new skills while exposed to the same situation and triggers as the original situation.
Okay. So practicing all of these skills that can be found on page 254. The workbook gives an exercise that's very similar to our editing, splicing, and pasting technique. And we suggest you just stick with the editing, splicing, and pasting technique so you don't get confused. It's very, very similar. So reflecting on a conversation that didn't go as planned, that recently happened, and play it over in your imagination and use those self-soothing skills like radical acceptance, maybe mindful breathing to help you pendulate as you work through that situation and edit out what went wrong and paste in what you would do differently in the future. The workbook gives some really great examples on pages 255 and 256 in the workbook. And because of time, I won't go over those, but it really is helpful. I was looking at them last night and I thought they were great examples. So we do encourage you to read over those. And you know that the more we visualize the new edited splice and paste scenarios, the better we'll become at using DBT skills. The more you practice, in time, it'll become more automatic in real life situations. We promise it does work. And we can practice visualizing our new edited splice and paste scenarios with as many past situations in which we became activated and showed up as high numbers on our Holz diary card. And then just kind of skipping over this real quickly. As I said, Nicole and I plan on doing an interactive activity in a future session to kind of wrap up all the DBT skills we've been talking about this year. So putting it all together, it's not our fault if we have mental health issues, but it's our responsibility that our society to work at improving these skills, just like Humpty Dumpty, right? We won't improve our collective mental health if we don't understand how the mind works, don't have the right approaches to address our issues, and don't understand how society impacts these issues. So it starts with that understanding and awareness. We've already discussed the concept of cruel optimists, in which individuals are made to feel responsible for issues that are primarily systematic. We are familiar with Rudolf Virchow's assertions that medicine is a social science and politics nothing but medicine at a larger scale. And finally, improving mental health requires that we commit not only to improving our personal mental health, but also that of our families, community, countries, and the world as a whole. Have you ever heard the saying, if you smile, the whole world smiles with you? I like that. If you smile, the whole world smiles at you. You can make a difference, not just with yourself, but with the world as a whole. And the workbook suggests 5 daily practices: mindfulness, of course, deep relaxation, self-observation, affirmation, committed action. They list all of that in the workbook, and we'll try to touch on these when we do our little activity in a future session. And of course, we had our DBT diary card. I know you can go along and check all the skills that you're practicing in the week, hopefully, but we also have our list of all the skills we have learned this year so far. Look at 26 distress tolerance skills. That's a lot. Go through and select your top 3 and practice, build that into your daily routine. Mindfulness skills, 24 that we talked about. Pick a couple that you thought were helpful and build that into your routine. What about emotional regulation skills? There were 9 there, right? And interpersonal effectiveness skills. My goodness, 21 and counting. We're going to talk more through the IFS perspective in session 30 on dealing with challenging relationships. So we do look forward to that. There we go. You know, one thing that didn't come up on the slides was about Bill Eddy. It didn't show. I was wondering, where did it
For
go?
some reason, these not the right slides.
Oh, oh no,
Because I have several copies.
okay.
And, yeah, I sent you guys, I think I clicked on the wrong PowerPoint
Oh,
thing. I could look,
I think that was the only difference though, was the Bill Eddy.
yeah. But there are other changes that I made as well. Okay, you're all confused. But what happens is that, I have several PowerPoint, presentations. And, I kind of modified them and I keep them all on my desktop, which gets very confusing. So I think this is not the final one,
Okay,
which might affect also the stuff I'm gonna present, but we'll go from there.
it is what it is.
You know, it's just like, you can't give us 2 weeks off, it doesn't work. You know, it's smoother when we just kept
Yes.
going from week to week, but you know, as always, we do our best and we
Yeah.
try to. What is it you say, carry on, keep calm and carry on,
Keep calm and
keep in
carry
the
on.
window of tolerance and carry on,
Yes,
okay.
very
So,
good.
yeah, I was thinking as Joe and Nicole were talking about this, what I was thinking about is that. How overwhelming, you know, the DBT workbook is a fairly thin book, right? But just the amount of material they presented today, it can be pretty overwhelming, you know, these lists and what do you do with, how do you cope with resistance and from people, which is like a very common thing, right? And, you know, my thought is, stick to basic things. You know, don't try to understand everything. So, you know, some of the basic things we talked about is that don't try to use this next time you have a conflict with somebody. All right. But if you have a conflict with somebody and you're keeping a Hole's diary card and you have your targets, and maybe one of the targets is like conflictual relationships, that'll remind you that, oh, you know what? This didn't turn out as well as I hoped. I had this problem with this person, right? Let me go back and use my tools, right? And you know, do a chain analysis for what happened in this situation, right? Now I've learned a lot of skills. I've learned a lot of remediation skills. You know, we talked about cognitive behavioral therapy and all that. So how could this have gone better? That's the remediation. So it didn't go well, right? What could I have used? What skills could I have used? And one thing you always need to do is that if you go into emotional mind, if you're reworking, you know, using the editing, splicing, and pasting. If you remember, editing, splicing, and pasting is you take a situation that went not well, could be like an interpersonal situation, but it could be anything else, right? That you fell into a hole, right? And you want to rework it. This has already happened. And the idea behind that is that you're not going to be able to use these skills live until you've had so much practice. So you have to use them for something that already happened. Right? So the stuff that Joan and Nicole were talking about, don't try to apply it live. You'll be overwhelmed. Apply it to you know, interpersonal, because here we're talking about interpersonal conflicts, right? That's something that already happened. And now you have more time, right? And you think, well, it already happened. What's the point? You know, what's the use? The use is doing that for that past situation that already happened. It's going to teach you how to handle future situations. Okay. And now you have more time, right? You have more time to, first of all, you know, you have to stay in the window of tolerance as you're doing this. So, you know, there's the pendulation. So if you find yourself, you know, kind of going outside, dealing with this past situation that you're trying to come up with a remediation for, and you're going outside the window of tolerance, remember, get back into the window of tolerance. Pendulate, you know, use your emotional regulation skills. All right. And then keep going. Keep looking at your lists, the lists of skills, So what skills could I have used here? Would it have called for the skills that Joan and Nicole talked about today? Okay. So if you feel overwhelmed, get back to the basics. You know, we presented 6 tools. Those tools are very, very useful. Start with those, right? They'll kind of keep you oriented. Right. So that was just, so wrapping up DBT, I think that's the message we want to convey. You know, feeling overwhelmed is being outside the window of tolerance. All right. But, you know, get yourself back into the window of tolerance. This stuff, it's not easy, but it's doable. Even if you've learned a little bit at the time. Right. And you guys, you've learned a lot so far in the course. Okay. So that was a little bit of a wrap up of what Joan and Nicole presented. All right, so before we turn to IFS, because a lot of this course, or many people that participate in this course, and you know, we have attachment issues, all right? And remember, attachment is how we learn to relate when we were little. Okay? And you can learn to relate in a secure way. But many of us, you know, by a lot of statistics, like up to 60% of people in the world have insecure attachment styles. Yeah? And that attachment, insecure attachment is a form of trauma. It's a form of not being heard, right? Not being seen. And so we talked a lot about attachment, which is the root of a lot of our issues. And then we talked a lot about trauma as well, okay? Which interacts with attachment. And so, you know, I think one of the things that, you know, I believe, and we talked about a bit about Bessel van der Kolk. If you remember, he says that his famous quotation is that if you take trauma away from the DSM, DSM is the classification of diagnosis and in psychiatry, and it's like 900 pages, right? And he says if you take trauma away from DSM, you're left with a small pamphlet, okay? And that's certainly my impression, and not to say that everything in psychiatry is trauma, but I think attachment and trauma play a huge role. And I think one of the things that we kind of highlighted in the course, we've highlighted how blind we have been to that because we paid so much attention to biological psychiatry and, you know, come up with diagnoses instead of probing deeper and learning about people's lives and their histories. And so we've been blind to that, but I think that's been a very costly mistake because, you know, we've relied on medications and stuff. And although I'm not anti-medication, I do prescribe a lot of medication. What I see repeatedly, it only goes so far. You know, yesterday we were talking to somebody, and, you know, this person was very depressed, right? And, you know, tried different medications. Now she's on the medications. She said, oh, you know, I'm better, right? Like when I was at the depth of my despair, my depression, I was like a 10, 0 to 10, like 10 is the worst. 0 is like not being depressed. And so we asked her, well, where are you now? Well, so I'm kind of like a 7, 6 or a 7 now, right? And, you know, if you're expecting medication to do all the work and take you from there to a 0, I think that's a little bit unrealistic. You can expect a little bit, but then what we got into is that, you know, it's a process of grief also, right? But not straightforward grief. It's grief in a way, I won't go into it, but the way we've talked about in this course. So that's just to say that trauma is very central. And that's why, you know, we're talking about this before we turn to IFS, because IFS is a trauma processing approach, right? Because it's a way of dealing with what we call burden parts that are carrying trauma, that are carrying a lot of hurt. So we have to finish up on how you recover from trauma. All right, and I apologize because these aren't the final version of the slides. I kind of keep improving them, but then I get disorganized. But all right, so just to when we talk about structural dissociation theory, which is a few weeks back, if you remember, we talked about that in trauma therapy, there's 3 stages, right? And the 3 stages are, the first one is stabilization. Stabilization is really learning to, as much as possible, return to the window of tolerance. Stabilization is all about DBT is stabilization. It's like, how do you get back to the window of emotional tolerance, right? That's the first step of trauma therapy. You have to get better at it. It's not going to be perfect. You're not going to be calm all the time, but you have to have the stress tolerance strategies to kind of like, how do I calm my nervous system down? How do I get back into calm or alert, as opposed to being fight or flight or being in freeze? Because when you're in those, you're not going to be able to use any of this. Okay, so that's stabilization. Stage 1. Stage 2 of trauma process, or stage 2 of trauma therapy, is remembrance and mourning, or processing trauma. Right? Once you've learned to be able to get back into the window of tolerance, now you have to go and dig a little bit deeper, right? And kind of understand, where does my trauma come from, right? What caused my trauma? And how do I work with this trauma? What are like some approaches that can help me to work through the trauma that I've experienced? That's where IFS comes in. It's a really good way of working through your trauma, right? So that's stage 2. And stage 3 is resuming past psychosocial growth, because we know that people who are traumatized, they're not able, they're kind of, they got off the world has continued, right? Continued to turn, and they often feel that they're not part of the world, right? And resuming past psychosocial growth is, how do you get back into the world? How do you live a full life, right? Because that's ultimately the goal. But these other things prevent you from doing that. Trauma or attachment issues prevent you from joining the world. And so you have to do this as well. So today we're going to consider something that's complementary to these 3 stages, because the 3 stages, it's not like, some people, they just do stage 1, and, that is helpful enough that they don't need to do anything else. So you don't need to do absolutely all of them. You can go a long ways, and you don't necessarily do them like in a sequence. You can do a little bit of one, and then do a little bit of, and then go back to the first. So they're kind of intermixed. It's not a very neat, clear sequence. But what I wanted to bring up, because this is something we've already covered when we talked about the structural dissociation theory. What I want to talk about today is a complementary concept, which is the 4 pillars of trauma recovery. All right. So think of it as, that's why I put that Greek temple there, because the 4 pillars are the structures that support or uphold the 3 stages. 3 stages are like the roof of the temple. The 4 pillars support that roof. So you can't have, if you only have like one pillar, the roof is going to be off balance. So you need those 4 pillars. That's how they're complementary. So what are the, and this is just, I'm not going to go over that. It's a bit of a review. We talked about that we talked about structural dissociation. And so how are the 4 pillars of trauma recovery related to the 3 stages of trauma therapy? You might be asking yourself. So unlike the 3 stages we talked about a minute ago, 4 pillars of trauma recovery are not a sequence, okay, of the work to be done. The 4 pillars are part of trauma work that, like a Greek temple, underlie or support all three stages of trauma therapy. So they're integral to each one of those three stages. You have to do all these four pillars during each of those three stages, right? So in other words, the four pillars help us accomplish each of the three stages. You need the four pillars in stage 1, you need the four pillars in stage 2, you need the four pillars in stage 3, right? So you need to be doing them. And so don't worry about this. I'm not introducing any new material because this has been incorporated into the course already. So this is not new, but it's just to kind of explain things to you a little bit better. All right. So let's briefly review these four pillars which are incorporated into Simple. So the first pillar is psychoeducation. So trauma healing rests on 4 interdependent pillars. I've already said that. None of them is sufficient alone, and all of them reinforce each other. Together, they create the conditions for safety, integration, and post-traumatic growth, right? Those are the 3 stages, right? Safety, integration, post-traumatic growth, 3 stages. So the first pillar is psychoeducation. And so in this course is like very, very heavy on psychoeducation, right? We give you a lot of information about how the mind works, right? That's all psychoeducation. So it's already part of this course. So psychoeducation is the process of learning how trauma actually works biologically, psychologically, relationally, and how we can understand why and how our symptoms and lived experiences make sense. Yeah. So one of the things people say in this course is that, oh, you know, it's relief to kind of understand why I feel this way. That it's not because I'm crazy, but there's reasons why I feel this way. That's the power of psychoeducation. It can really help us to understand ourselves. And instead of I often have people say, this is crazy. And my first reaction, whenever people say that, no, it's not crazy. This is completely understandable. I understand what you're saying because, we have the theory to understand, right? So that's so important. So trauma creates confusion. Why am I like this? Why do I overreact? Why can't I just get over it? Psychoeducation replaces shame with explanation, right? When people can name what is happening, for example, this is my sympathetic system getting activated, they feel less effective and more empowered. Understanding becomes the first step towards regulating. First pillar is psychoeducation, right? Which, is a big part of this course. Second pillar, and you're going to say, as I go through this, you're going to say, well, yeah, of course, this is very self-evident, right? So the second pillar is having healthy relationships. Okay? One of the things we strive for in this course is to relate securely, right? That doesn't mean you don't have to relate securely. You don't have to be securely attached. I mean, I think there's very few people who are perfectly securely attached. A lot of us have some attachment issues. But despite that, you can still relate securely. Maybe not all the time. But when you know what it is, you can do it. Because relating securely is, not just being focused on yourself. It's sort of like doing unto others you like others to do unto you. That's relating securely. Is, considering that this person has a mind, they have their, wishes, they have their wants. And I really want to listen to them. I just don't want to react to them. That's giving them space. Relating securely is sort of like what we expect of ideal parents, which is listening deeply to their kids, right? Being attentive. Now, we can't always do that, but I think we try to practice that a little bit with each other, like in our teams, like at work. I think we try to do that. No, not perfect, right? But those, I think, are, it's not like you have to have 100% healthy relationships, but you have to kind of know what healthy relationships are and try to create them. Okay, so trauma almost always occurs in the context of disrupted or unsafe relationships. That's obvious, right? Trauma doesn't occur if there's safe relationships. Healing requires relational experiences that provide safety, attunement, predictable care, and the chance to rewire attachment patterns. Okay, I think that's the beauty of the psychotherapeutic approach, because see, like, I think that biological psychiatry doesn't really listen deeply. It kind of listens superficially, so it gets like people's symptoms and stuff. I don't think people feel really hurt. I think in psychotherapy, like approaches like we talk about in this course, I think people feel a little bit more deeply hurt and deeply seen. Okay? The material you go over here in the course that we've covered is a way of helping you to see yourself and to say that we see you too. Okay, we see each other. Right? It's a deeper approach than just looking at the surface, looking at symptoms. Right? So healing relationships can be with a professional, right? And I mean, I think you've all experienced that. You might have experienced relationships with professionals that weren't healing because they weren't listening. They might have been judging. And the ones that really touch us is the ones where we really feel hurt, right? Even if it's not, even if you see somebody once or, you know, every 2 months or every 3 months, still, you know, that those can stay with us. I think it'd be really important, right? So they can be with a professional, it can be in a group, right? With friends or partners who model emotional safety. It can be with mentors. It can be even with a community. Okay? And I think this is precious, and we seek this out, right? The nervous system is a social organ, right? It's not individual, it's about being together. It learns safely through another nervous system. Healthy relationships provide co-regulation when someone becomes dysregulated, mirroring and validation, boundaries, and a sense of belonging. When people experience healthy relational patterns, they gradually replace the old trauma-driven ones. Okay, and you know, one thing that I saw in my psychiatric practice was, so I met a lot of people that you know, had a lot of trauma or attachment issues, but they ended up with very caring partners, understanding partners. I always thought, you know, this is like the best therapy you can have, right? Being with somebody like that, or having, doesn't have to be a partner, it could be like friends. That's the best therapy, right? By the same token, you see people, and this is like what we call repetition compulsion, people often also end up with people in their lives that are repeating early abusive patterns. And that can perpetuate the damage and you know, the trauma. So you can have either, right? So where was I? Okay. Safe relationships are the most powerful regulator of the nervous system, right? I mean, this is like so obvious. You know, when somebody comes to our office, sometimes they're really dysregulated. And people's nervous systems synchronize to each other, right? So it's like tend to kind of go in the same place. So either you can become, if you're somebody who's dysregulated, either you can become dysregulated, and then there's two dysregulated people, and that happens often, or if you're with somebody who's dysregulated and you have some wise mind or self, in the sense that you can, oh, I know what's happening here. So you have understanding. This person's nervous system, they're not in the window of tolerance, all right? And you kind of go, okay, you know what? This is like a bit of a force field here, but I know if I can stay grounded, if I can remain in the window of tolerance, eventually, I know this person will join me there, okay? And I think that's like a really rewarding kind of neat thing in psychiatry is how quickly that happens. I'm sure you guys have that experience as well, that if you can stay well regulated, somebody comes in, by the end of the session, they're kind of like, oh, it's not so bad. Right? They're in a different place because you're co-regulating. All right. So that's why it's so important for mental health professionals to know how to regulate themselves, right? Okay. So when someone is reliably present and attuned, our system receives the message, you're not alone, you are safe enough. This supports the shift from ventral vagal, right? No, sorry, not from dorsal vagal, right? Which is freeze, into ventral vagal, which is about connection. And calm and meaning become possible, right? So it's kind of neat to, when you know how trauma works, you know, polyvagal theory and stuff like that. It's kind of neat to see that in action, right? All right. So that's the second pillar, healthy relationships, right? They don't have to be perfectly healthy, but it's something we can foster. Third pillar is trauma-informed therapies, right? So, you know, I kind of, much of my life in psychiatry was before we knew so much about trauma as we do today. Or, you know, like I think we've known about trauma since Janet 100 years ago, but it wasn't kind of really put out there. And so a lot of therapy, I think, was relatively effective, but stuff that I was doing until I learned this stuff more. And a lot of therapy is just, okay, let's just talk. Okay. I think there's good stuff about that. Not sure that's like terribly helpful, right? Because, you know, there's really a lot of science and a lot of good stuff behind what we've been talking about. This is not just simply let's talk. That can be okay. But when therapy is informed by all we've been talking about, all we've learned, it becomes much more powerful. Okay. So this is where trauma-informed therapies are important. So there's structured, evidence-based, trauma-specific modalities that help the person safely process traumatic memories. Evidence-based trauma-informed therapies include IFS. So that's the one we're going to focus on. There's other ones, but this is kind of the one that I know a little bit more about, right? I've kind of explored others, like somatic experiencing, but I kind of like this one. And so there's a lot of other ones, but you have to pick and choose. And they all have like their pros and cons. And for some people, one might work a little bit better than another, but IFS is a really, really good one. Trauma is not stored in the rational brain. We know that, we've talked a lot about that, but in the body, in implicit memory, fear networks, and attachment templates. Trauma therapies help unburden frozen emotional states, update the nervous system's threat response, replace traumatic with coherent meaning, and integrate the past into a stable sense of self. Without targeted trauma-informed interventions, psychoeducation alone rarely changes entrenched trauma patterns. So psychoeducation, that one pillar, that's important, but it's not enough. You have to have all these 4 pillars. You know, the healthy experiences, relationships. You have to have like trauma-informed therapies, right? This pillar is about deep change, not just about coping, which DBT is more about coping, right? This is about change. All right. Finally, The fourth pillar is movement, right? And this is like, one's like, oh, really? I hadn't thought about that so much. But this is hugely, hugely, hugely important. Again, Joan and I met with somebody yesterday. And when you're in dorsal vagal, right, which is frozen. So when you're grieving or when you're deeply depressed, what do you want to do? You want to crawl in a hole, right? You want to go into the fetal position. You want to go in a hole and you don't want to move. And this person we were talking with yesterday, she says, well, I stay in bed all day. Even though like I'm a little bit, it's not as hard to get out of bed as it was like before I couldn't get out of bed at all. Now, it's a little bit easier, but I'm still like in bed all day. That's like crawling into your hole and not getting out. Okay. And so, what we were saying to her is that, yeah, there's a part of you, you're kind of blended with this part. There's a part of you, very emotional part, the very depressed, the grieving part that says, just hunker down in your hole in the fetal position. Don't get out of there. Right? But what happens is that if we have no perspective on that, and we're totally possessed by that part, that actually leads into a negative feedback loop. Okay, the more we do that, the less we're involved in the work. Right? We're not in the world at all. And what we were talking about with her was that, so I was asking her, when you do some things, do you feel a little bit better? And she said, yeah. And she said, like, leading up to it, before I do something, this part of me says, like, I don't want to do it. It's impossible. But once I do it, I actually feel a little bit better after. Okay, this is like exactly what she was saying, right? But it's still very hard, even though she knows rationally that she feels a little bit better. Right? Very hard, because before that other part, the depressed part, is in control. All right, and this is where you have to have wise mind, right, or self. So self or wise mind is what helps you to. I know there's this part of me that wants me to stay in the hole, but I know, and I have like a little bit of perspective, not 100% like possessed by this depressed part. I know that if I do this, I will feel better. And so what you're doing is, we were talking about how, with grief, moving from the dorsal vagal to ventral vagal is about, going from not feeling part of the world, being in your hole, right, to rejoining the world. And that is how, you heal, right? But it's hard because like trauma and attachment issues make you not trust the world. And we're saying, rejoin the world, right? And movement is what is required, right? Because when you're in your home, you're not moving. But movement, your body is saying, I'm moving towards something, right? So this is why movement is so important. So movement reconnects the individual with body awareness, regulates rhythms, completes fight-flight impulses that were interrupted, grounds and orients. During trauma, the body often initiates an impulse to run, fight, block, scream, or reach, but cannot complete it. It creates stuck physiological activation. Movement helps reconnect the prefrontal cortex in the body, release chronic muscular tension, downshift sympathetic arousal, expand the window of tolerance, provide mastery, pleasure, and embodiment. Okay. In polyvagal terms, trauma often leaves us stuck in sympathetic survival activation and dorsal vagal shutdown. The pathway back to connection is physiological. The nervous system moves through states via the body. So gentle, rhythmic, regulated movements such as walking, stretching, rocking, yoga, breath-link motion help the system transition out of shutdown or survival modes. So, sometimes it's just, even taking one step, right? That taking one step and maybe taking another, that is the beginning, right? All right. So in summary, healthy relationships provide safety. Movement restores physiological flow. Therapy processes what got stuck, and understanding reduces our fear. Together, these 4 pillars support nervous system journey back into connection. To better understand how these pillars fit together, think of trauma therapy as a house, right? Psychoeducation is the blueprint that helps you understand the architecture of the house. Healthy relationships are the foundation that make the house solid and safe. Trauma-informed therapies are like structural renovations where unstable old structures are repaired, and movement is the electrical system ensuring energy flows through the whole house and doesn't get stuck. Okay, so I'm not going to go over that, but that's a summary of what we talked about. Right, so I encourage you to go to the website and take a look at that. So to recap, the 3 stages is when you do things, kind of a timeline. The emotional regulation, trauma processing, and resuming psychosocial growth. The pillars is what we need to do in each of those stages. All right. So I think I'm just looking at the time, and I know we're a little bit early for our break. All right. But because we're going to be moving to, the 3rd section of today, which is introducing you to IFS, I think I'm going to take a break there. I'm also going to look for my PowerPoint presentation that's up to date. Yeah, let's take a 10-minute break. We can stop recording. Okay. So guys, no, don't want to do that. This we're going into new territory, right? Every other part of the course up till now, well, not this session, next session. This is still we're still kind of treading on old territory. When we get to IFS, we've talked about IFS before in the course, but not to this depth, right? So this is all new. So it's kind of like a little bit of, you're the first group in all the years we've been doing this course that's going to get this. So we'll see how it goes. It's not as well tested as the stuff we've done before, right? Even though every year we change things a little bit. This is all new, so bear with us. We'll see how it goes. All right, let me just fast forward here. Okay. All right. Can you see my screen? Or am I not sharing?
I can see it.
You can see my screen? Okay. All right. So in our mindfulness practice today, we talked about switching from a DBT map to an IFS map. So do you like those AI generated images? It's pretty cool, right? So the woman there, the one that Joan and Nicole had before, the person was folding up the DBT map, right? This one, she's kind of like looking into the IFS map as opposed to the DBT map. So I hope you appreciate those little details. Okay. So this is a quotation from my favorite philosopher. And this is in a book I just read during my break called The Daemon and the Soul of the West. Great book. It's kind of a bit autobiographical. And quotation is, what is this thing we call a self? When there seem to be so many agencies within me, each with its own knowledge, dispositions, and will. Okay, so I think we all have that sensation. We're not kind of like a clear simple, you know, we have all these voices going on, right? All right, so, having said that, want to introduce Stu. And do you want to come up here for a second? So Stu is a co-leader that's going to join us for the next, until the end of IFS. You just want to say a little bit about yourself and your training and why you're doing this and what we're going to do?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm so excited to be here and doing the IFS section with you guys. Actually went through COVID, I think 2019, did some co-facilitation
Yeah.
in an earlier iteration of the group, and I'm really happy to be back for this. I started in child and youth work, and I worked in group homes, and there was a lot of youth that had some pretty severe trauma, and did a lot of the DBT skills and worked on kind of helping them manage and try and stay in the window of tolerance, as you guys are doing here. And then I was talking with Dr. Clado, and I was like, this is great, but how do we kind of move past, what do we use for trauma processing? Because when it comes up, it's great to be able to manage it, but how do we kind of move forward? And he recommended I look into and kind of check out IFS. And I just really kind of fell in love with the model and always used the like framework as I was learning about it. Would this be safe to use and introduce to any of the youth that I worked with? And the answer always kind of seemed to be a resounding yes. And then did some of the kind of therapeutic work myself within IFS counselor, and found like, yeah, just a really profound healing and way of viewing different things and different parts of myself internally. And I'm just really excited to kind of share that with you guys and kind of grow with you.
So you're going to be more, participate more actively when we get to session 24. It's not so much in today and next week,
Yeah.
but after that, both you and Kate are going to be a big part of what we're going to talk about. Yeah, so thank you. Yes, great, thank you. Okay. All right. And Stu is, he has a degree in social work, so he's master's of social work, and you primarily in your practice, you primarily use internal family systems and DBT a little bit as well.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. So, you know, as I go through this, if there's anything you want to add to what I'm saying today and next week, feel free to do so, okay? Because I think you know a lot more about IFS than I do, so. Oh, you use it a lot more, for sure. Okay, I love IFS, but because I'm a general psychiatrist, I don't get to do like regular IFS sessions. I kind of dabble in it. I don't see people every week, for example, right? Which is like more, you know, when you're in therapy, I might see people every, you know, most people I see like every 3 months or so, which is not like conditions to do therapy, although we do kind of touch on it. And a lot of people that I work with are doing IFS with other therapists, right? So, yeah. All right. So this is a little bit of a plan for sessions 22, which is this week, and 23. So we've wrapped up the DBT, told you a little bit about the 4 pillars of trauma therapy. And what we're going to do today is a little bit of an overview of the next 8 sessions, so 22 to 29. Give you an overview of what we're going to do. We're going to talk a little bit about maps for healing, talk about why IFS as opposed to other approaches, talk about how IFS includes and transcends, and about how they're the same holes with different maps, right? And then we'll complete our orientation next week. So just to recap, one of the main goals of this course, and we started that in the very first week, we talked about that metaphor of the holes in the sidewalk, right? What this course is about is how do you get out of your holes faster, right? And eventually, how do you avoid the holes altogether? So that's trauma therapy, right? Because trauma causes you to fall into holes. for a lot of people. So to do this, we started by naming these holes, right? So we all have different holes, and we came up with, targets, and listing them in our holes diary card, right? So you have to know what you're working on. Then, over the past several months, we explored tools, skills, and maps to help us understand the holes and how to heal ourselves. That's what we've been doing. Understanding why you fall into these holes all the time. And how do you get out of them? How do you get back into the window of tolerance? And what are these holes about? That's what this whole course is about. So it kind of hinges on that poem. There's a hole in my sidewalk. So we've discussed the key skills, models of trauma, and attachment. So in the last section of the course, from now until the end, we're going to turn towards a model that integrates much of what we previously discussed. That's internal family systems. This and next week, so weeks 22 and 23, are going to be an orientation to the IFS model. Weeks 24 to 29, we will work through Richard Schwartz's The Internal Family Systems Workbook, which focuses on identifying IFS parts, understanding those parts, contacting self, and unburdening our trauma. Okay, so that's 24 to 29. Let me tell you a little bit about, run with this metaphor. So this is a metaphor I really like. Maps into mind, right? We've kind of talked about this a lot because, we've said that these are maps, they're not the actual territory. The actual territory is your experience. Okay? So the map is never the territory. But maps can be useful, right? So not all maps show the same level of detail. The simplest maps are little more than lists of roads. So that's the map at the top there. They tell us how to get from point A to point B, but they don't show us much about the surrounding landscape or the territory. We know where the roads are, but not what the territory is really like. That's the simplest maps. More advanced maps start adding more details or more context. They show landmarks, rivers, parks, mountains, and neighborhoods. These maps help us orient ourselves better. We begin to understand not just the roads, but the environment we're traveling through. So that's the bottom map there a little bit. Then there's digital maps with a 360 street view, like those when you go on Google Maps. Such maps allow us to almost stand inside the environment. We can turn in different directions, see buildings, notice the terrain, and get a much richer sense of where we are and how to navigate that terrain. Each one of these three kinds of maps can still get us somewhere, right? But the richer the map, the easier it is to understand where we are and how we can move forward. So better maps of the mind make healing easier, right? This is where it ties in with what we were talking about during the question period. So biological psychiatry gives us simple and useful maps, but they're simple. Okay? Then psychological and trauma models, which we've been exploring in the course, give us richer models. And I hope you took that away from what we've been talking about, that they were richer models to help you understand yourself. Okay? Internal family systems, to me, is like the Google map. It's not the territory, right? But it includes and goes beyond the biological and psychological maps by offering a multidimensional map of the mind and a clear pathway for healing. Right. So I've said that IFS includes and integrates other theories. So how does it do that? How does it include models we've already discussed, the maps we've already discussed? So this is where, what are we doing for time? We have about an hour, about 40 minutes. I'm going to skip over, and we might come back to this, but for the sake of time, because I have a lot of slides, I'm going to skip over this part here. Maybe just to say, just going to quickly summarize it. So different maps of mind use different names for the holes we fall into. talked about the holes. Right? So if you have a biological map, what does biological maps or biological psychiatry, what do they call the holes? They call it depression. They call it anxiety. Okay? So different maps use different names for the holes we fall into. They call it things like ADHD or dissociative disorders. So diagnosis tells us something important about our mental health, but it's not very specific, right? And we've talked a lot about this, that depression, yeah, I mean, but there's all kinds of depression. There's depression that goes with grief. There's depression that people have had their whole life. There's depression that started after, an episode of trauma. There's all kinds of depression. So depression is a useful map, but it doesn't give us a lot of detail. Okay? And then, because we only have that map, we only have so many interventions that arise from that map. Then we talked about psychological maps. So things like we talked about developmental theory, when we talked about Erik Erikson, psychosocial development, talked about trauma, talked about attachment. So psychological models gives them more detailed descriptions of the holes we fall into. Okay? Attachment theory describes holes as the holes you fall into. Oh, it's maybe kind of a result of avoidant attachment, anxious attachment, disorganized attachment. So it has different names for the holes. And it's kind of a deeper, richer understanding. Structural dissociation theory also has different names for the holes. They talk about emotional parts and apparently normal parts. Polyvagal theory. And the thing is, all of these, they fit together. They're kind of different psychological models, but they're complementary. So attachment, polyvagal, they fit really well together. Structural dissociation theory, they fit really well together. So these psychological models include biology. So it's not to say that, we don't have like chemicals in our brain. We do. Okay? So it includes that. It includes the concept of depression. It doesn't say depression doesn't exist, right? It says depression exists, but let's look at it in a kind of more refined way. Let's understand it a little bit more deeply, right? So these psychological models include biology and the labels that biology gives us, but transcended by explaining how experiences and relationships shape who we are. They help us understand how, over time, our holes developed, right? How did I become depressed? How did I become anxious? How does this relate to my lived experience? And then you have IFS maps, right? And IFS maps, because it's internal family systems, and IFS gives us this model where, it's not just one you inside. You have many parts, which kind of reminds us a little bit of structural dissociation theory, right? With their emotional parts. We talked about how, structural dissociation theory, PTSD is where you get this dissociation between an apparently normal part and an emotional part. And when you get into complex PTSD, is you get a dissociation between apparently normal parts and then multiple emotional parts. Now, that's so close to internal family systems. It says there's all these different parts. So structural dissociation, which is like a trauma theory, and internal family systems, very, very similar. Slightly different maps, but they kind of overlap a lot. So IFS goes one step further than biological and psychological maps. Instead of describing the holes as a diagnosis or psychological concepts, is that it identifies part selves within the psyche that embody the holes. So the holes in internal family system, and okay, this is going to be hard to understand, but when you're in a hole in internal family systems, is when a part is dominant. And you're gonna learn, okay, now I feel depressed. What part of me is that? Okay, I'm in a hole. Okay, but it's not just depression. It's a part that is taken off, or maybe multiple parts. Right? So we're gonna learn, that's what we're gonna learn when we do this approach. So what biology might call depression, IFS sees as a hopeless exile. Don't worry about the terms, we'll get into that. A self-critical manager or a numbing firefighter. Not familiar with that, but don't worry about it. What attachment theory calls avoidant attachment, IFS might see as a protective distancing manager or a part that suppresses vulnerable feelings. What structural dissociation calls emotional parts, IFS might see as exiles. In IFS, the holes we fall into are associated with a specific part carrying a specific burden, which can be approached directly with compassion and self-leadership. Okay, you don't have to remember that. I'm just saying what we're going to explore. Okay, this is a preview. You don't have to understand that right now. Okay. So different models use different languages, but are describing the same territory. Except I think they're describing the same territory, but they describe it better. So I think IFS describes it really well. And I mean, people, when it's so intuitive, a lot of stuff like as I was training, we did a lot of psychodynamic psychiatrists like Freud and stuff. And so much of it was like, this is not intuitive at all, right? This is so intuitive. It's like people hear it and they go, huh, it makes sense. Now you couldn't get really deep into it, but it is very intuitive. So user-friendly. So IFS may not be the territory itself, but it is one of the most complete and intuitive maps we currently have for understanding who we are and how healing can happen. So I'm just kind of promoting it at this point, getting you sort of enthusiastic about it. All right, so that's IFS includes, but goes beyond biological and psychological models. So that's like depicting it in an image. Biological is like small, psychological contains it, goes beyond, and then IFS contains all those other ones, right? So throughout the course, we've been exploring different maps of the mind. Biological psychiatry describes suffering using diagnosis like depression or anxiety and focuses on brain circuits and medication. Psychological models expand that map by helping us understand attachment patterns, trauma responses, and nervous system states like fight, flight, or freeze. Internal family systems includes those insights that goes beyond them by giving us a map of a family of parts that make up our minds, protect us, and carry our wounds. At the center of that map is capital S self, which, the other day you asked a very good question because you said, what's the difference, similarity between capital S self and wise mind? Right? Do you remember? And at first, I hadn't thought about that before, but since then, it's like, oh, they are quite different, right? So wise mind is much more of psychological, belongs to a psychological map, right? A DBT map, whereas capital S self belongs to a more an IFS map, which goes beyond. So capital S self goes beyond. It includes wise mind, goes beyond them. And we'll talk about how it goes beyond as we get into this. All right, I'm going to skip over that. So this is a summary. DBT helps us manage our reactions. Reactions meaning feelings, behaviors, thoughts, right? That's what DBT does. IFS helps us understand the parts of us that are reacting in those ways. Up until now, we've been working with thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. IFS invites us to meet the parts that generate these thoughts, feelings, behaviors. What we're going to do is we're going to meet the parts, right, that cause us to fall into these holes, that are associated with, our anxiety and our depression, right? We're going to meet like our internal family. All right, I'm going to skip over that because of time. but you're welcome to go back to the website and take a look at it. Okay. Now, just want to touch on this because this past Monday, there was an interesting session in our blind group. And one of the things, one of the people who participated in the Monday session, what they brought up is they said, you know, we're going into IFS, right? And you've mentioned several times that IFS is kind of a spiritual approach. Said, but you know what? Like, I wasn't raised with that. I kind of like, you've talked about spirituality, but kind of like, I have sort of an aversion or almost I'm allergic to it, to spirituality, right? So kind of a little bit afraid that this might not work for me. Okay, so that was one of the things that in Monday session people brought. We had quite an interesting discussion about this. Because, I think people, equate religion and spirituality. And I think what came out of it, I think this person, after our discussion, said, oh, okay, I understand this a little bit better. But what we talked about is what is, spirituality is many things, and I'm kind of butchering it here, but what is the essence of it? Okay, what we said is that we've talked a little bit about this before. One of the things that philosophy is a way of thinking rationally about our world, right? Not thinking emotionally, thinking rationally about it. And one of the questions that we've asked from the time, back to the cognitive revolution 70,000 years ago, what makes us human is that we ask questions, we think, right? One of the questions that humans have always asked is, what is this all about? What's the nature of all this, right? Why are we here? Why is there something rather than nothing, right? And one of the fields in philosophy is called metaphysics, which asks, what is the fundamental nature of reality? What's at the source, at the root of all this? And to greatly simplify this, and this is what we're talking about on Monday, there have been two main answers. Not greatly, I'm butchering this because there's more than two answers, but people have said what we were talking about is that in our experience, there seem to be two kinds of things, right? If you think about it. So there seem to be like material things like this wall and, this desk, all right? So there's material things, but there's also mental things, all right? So mental thing is not a material thing, right? It's something different. It's like a thought. You can't weigh it, can't measure it, right? So I think that was like an original insight humans had, is that there seemed to be like two different types of things, sort of mental and material things. And metaphysics kind of came from that. And so what is fundamental? Is it material? Is the world at the tiniest level, is it fundamentally material thing like forces and fundamental particles? Or is it fundamentally mental? Consciousness, right? So people have always had, they kind of argued for one, some people prefer one, some people prefer another. But if you look at history, the history of humanity, probably 99% people have felt that what is fundamental is mind. Okay, consciousness. is what gives rise to everything. I can't go into that, but you know, if you look at those 800 slides that when we did the wellness, the goals diary card procedure, go into that a little bit. So, but the thing is that those are called people who think that what is fundamental is mine. They're called idealists. And idealism doesn't entail necessarily God, but it makes room for God. Right? But it doesn't necessarily say there's a God, because there's other kinds of idealism. Right? You can have universal consciousness that is not God. Right? But that's what this is fundamentally about. Now, so 99% of everyone who's ever lived has had a idealist framework, right? That's why they believe in God, the creator, well, creations of this mind thing. But we live in the 1% of the time where we're convinced that what is fundamental, you know, what the basic nature of the universe is matter. Okay. Now, so forces and fundamental particles. Okay, that's our scientific model. Now that has an implication, because if forces and matter and fundamental particles is what is fundamental, what it means is that forces and fundamental particles create our brains, right? And our brain creates consciousness, right? That's what's called physicalist or materialist model. What does that mean? It means that we're all separate, right? My consciousness arises from matter, arises from my brain. I'm separate from you. And there's nothing connecting us, right? So if you're a materialist, see, because we've talked a lot in this course about connection and disconnection, right? And, you know, how we have this great desire to feel connected because it gives us meaning, right? We want to be connected to ourselves. We want to be connected to others. We want to be connected to meaningful work. We want to be connected to, you know, nature. And we want to be connected to something greater than us. And if you feel connected, if you have a story that helps you to feel connected, and you believe that story, it's very meaningful. Because it's not just about you. You're not just like an isolated little atom separate from everybody else. The problem is that, see, like our metaphysics are, you know, in the last 100 years, we've been brainwashed to think that we're really very separate and everybody's separate and we're all alone in this. Okay? Which gives rise to this sense, you know, existential despair. Right? So what is spirituality? Spirituality is about feeling connected, right? Spiritual experiences and mystical experiences, what are they about? They're about transcending your small s self, right? So kind of like, I'm not just like a disconnected individual, but those mystical and spiritual experiences, when people have them, they feel connected to nature, or they feel that, you know, this work, I'm not just doing this to make money, right? I'm doing this because, you know, I'm doing something for the universe, right? It's not about me, right? You know, fundamentally, and this is what Carl Jung was talking about, because Jung thought, you know, Freud saw us all as, you know, the iceberg theory. You know, we have an unconscious, but we're all icebergs floating in the ocean separately. Carl Jung saw us as archipelagos. If you go deep enough, we all join, right? Our consciousness is one, right? So as we kind of get into IFS is a spiritual model. But it's spiritual not in the sense that it says, oh, you have to follow this religion or this other religion. It's spiritual in the sense that, it says we're all connected. And when we talk about capital S self in IFS, it's a very spiritual concept. It's, it says it's the same in each one of us, capital S self, we all share that. And fundamentally, we're different expressions of that capital S self. And if we can connect with that, and we can be aware that it's there, we feel very connected. Okay? If you're having trouble with the spiritual aspects of IFS, because they are there, and I was mentioning how, I'm listening to Richard Schwartz put out a series of lectures on IFS and spirituality, but he's not advocating one religion or another. He's advocating a type of idealism that says we're all connected. Okay, just like this intuition that mystics and spiritual people have always had. And, can we absolutely prove that? No. Is it like a really good story? Because it makes you feel like less like you're floating or an iceberg floating in the ocean. It's a really powerful story, right? Which can really help you to emotionally regulate. Anyways, I went on a wild tangent there, but this is what we were talking about on Monday. And, if other people here have sort of misgivings, because we kind of bring in others a little bit spiritual. You don't have to be spiritual at all to do IFS. Okay, but thing is, biological model psychiatry, where you look at neurotransmitters and stuff, it's very materialist, very physicalist. Right? I think like generally, the deeper you go, and this applies to physics as well. So a lot of physicists, and I was saying this, and this may be controversial because there's a lot of brilliant physicists that are physicalists or materialists. But a lot of the, physicists that deeply understand physics, they get to the point where they go, no, this is not just a materialist, physicalist universe. Okay, they become spiritual, not necessarily like in a religious sense, but that there's a greater mystery. Anyways, that's what we were talking about Monday. It was an interesting discussion. We talked about it for an hour. Anyways, I thought just kind of bring that in, but I went on a wild tangent. So, I told you that we talk a little bit about why did we choose IFS instead of there's many other trauma processing approaches. He said, why IFS? Why, do I really like IFS? Why does Stu really like IFS? Okay, kind of in love with it a little bit. Can't say, I did, before I did IFS, I did 3 years of training in somatic experiencing. So it's like, did a lot of training. And I think it's a great approach, but I'm not as enthusiastic about it, but it is a great approach. I just can't relate to it nearly as much as to IFS. So why IFS? One reason is IFS is a stage 2 trauma processing approach, which helps us to work directly with our traumas, our wounded parts, what's hurting us. Second reason, IFS integrates everything we've previously learned, but makes it simple in a way. Third reason, IFS provides an intuitive and very compelling map of the psyche. People really like this model. And fourth, IFS allows us to interact directly with our unconscious. Okay? Because it's hard. Unconscious is not visible to us. But these parts are unconscious. And we start interacting with these parts. And fifth, IFS can be self-directed. So, one of the things is that not everybody can afford to see a therapist because trauma work is very intensive. You can't see somebody every 3 months. It might help, right? But you have to kind of keep doing this, keep working at it. That's how it's going to have effects. But not everybody has access to that. The nice thing is that you can do a lot of this on your own. And we're going to do it with AI. And a lot of people are kind of a little wary of AI. And there's a lot of bad things about AI. But I think there's also some positive things. And I think it can help you do some of this work. And it's what we did together, this past summer. All right. So just want to give you my take on IFS. And this is before, next session, we're going to spend a lot of time, and maybe this session, if we have some time, giving you the basics of it. But I'm just kind of setting the framework a little bit. So after you've been in psychiatry for a while, I think you develop a healthy skepticism for fashionable new therapeutic approaches that are constantly being developed. So you get the sense it's kind of a little bit of fashion in the, I don't know how many years I've been in psychiatry, but every once in a while there's like a new approach and everybody's like, this is really exciting. And at first it's really exciting. And then it's kind of like people lose their enthusiasm. I remember, even cognitive behavioral therapy, when I was training in the 1980s, cognitive behavioral therapy was new, right? It was kind of one of these new approaches and everybody's like super excited, right? And now it's like, yeah, it's helpful, but it has its limitations. So we're not rejecting it. Cognitive behavioral therapy is wonderful. Dialectical behavioral therapy, same thing. That was like about 30 years ago. Dialectical behavioral therapy, wow, this is like fabulous. Now it's like, yeah, it's very useful. We use it here, but it's limited. So, in mental health, there's all these new approaches that come out, and there's all this enthusiasm, and people say, this is like going to solve everybody's problems, and then you go to workshops and you see demonstrations, and people are like suddenly healed in like one session. And you're kind of like, wow, it's like, why can't I do that? But it's like it doesn't work. It's not like that, right? But so yeah, you kind of see that. You see that happen, the longer you've been in this. You watch these new approaches arrive with great enthusiasm, each promising to be the model that finally transforms psychotherapy. The old adage that what is helpful about many of these approaches is not new, right? What is helpful is not new, and what is new is not helpful. Always kind of seems right to me, right? Because a lot of these things are just repackaging old things in kind of new sort of wraps, right? Some approaches do bring something genuinely valuable, but over time their limitations become clearer. They settle into a more modest role, helpful, but partial. They're not like the territory. They're not the final map. Internal family systems feels a bit different to me. Not because it claims to replace what came before, but because it seems to integrate much of what we have already learned in this course. Okay? It resonates deeply with deaf psychology, Freud and Jung, we've talked about, in a serious engagement with the unconscious, not as something vague or symbolic, but as a living inner world with structure, intention, and history. It fits naturally with trauma therapy, theory, where symptoms are understood as adaptations rather than pathologies. Strikingly, it also aligns with spiritual traditions that speak of a compassionate, witnessing awareness capable of holding suffering without being overwhelmed by it. Okay? So I'm telling you why it feels a little bit different. What is most compelling about IFS is how, for so many people, it accurately reflects their lived experience. People already know intuitively that they are not a single unified self. They say, part of me wants this, part of me doesn't, or something in me takes over. IFS doesn't impose a foreign framework. It gives language and structure to something people already feel. At the same time, IFS avoids the abstraction that can distance other depth approaches from everyday clinical work. It is practical without being reductive, relational without being sentimental. Ethically, IFS carries the deeply humane stance that every part of us makes sense in context, that even our most troubling patterns began as attempts to protect, and that healing comes not through elimination or control, but through understanding and relationship. I don't believe IFS is a complete map of the human mind, nor do I think that it will fully replace other approaches. But my sense is that it may endure in a different way, not as a passing fashionable fad, but as a foundational framework. Okay, it's not totally new, right? It's kind of different way of saying what these other models that we've been talking about are already saying. But maybe it's like a better language. It says this in a better way that other models say it in kind of more awkward way. That's what I appreciate about it. In that sense, IFS feels less like a trend and more like a classic, a way of seeing the human psyche that integrates what we have learned about suffering, adaptation, meaning, and compassion, and does so in a way that feels both clinically grounded and deeply true. All right, so we have 15 minutes. I'm going to leave 15 minutes for discussion because we had a good discussion at our break. But I wanted to kind of launch into this a little bit because next week we also have a lot of, our review IFS, we have a lot of slides. So let's get into the nitty gritty a little bit. This is just an overview still, right? And I'm going to start telling you about IFS proper rather than just promote it. So one question you might be asking, what is the origin story of internal family systems? Where does it come from? All right. So the idea that the human psyche or human mind is controlled by unseen forces has a long history. It's not new. So Hindu, Greek, and Roman mythologies saw a whole host of gods as influencing human affairs and the human mind. That's what the Greek and Roman gods were about. They influenced us. They made us do things, right? These gods had distinct personalities, domains they reigned over, like war, love, the sea, and favored or punished individuals or cities. Other entities, such as spirits, diamonds, and fates, also played roles. Rich mythology. This mythology wasn't just, it's like random stories. They were trying to get at something. Yeah, that's what mythology, and mythologies are, they're not fantasy. They're about something deep. They're trying to articulate something really deep about being human. Jewish and Christian theology introduced the notion of one omnipotent God. It nevertheless retained a complex spiritual realm that included angels, archangels, demons, and the Holy Spirit. Okay? So it's not just like one, even Christianity. There's like a whole host of things floating around in this realm, right? Christianity also holds that many spiritual beings can influence the human mind. For example, angels protect or communicate with humans, demons tempt, oppress, or possess. The Holy Spirit inspires prophecy, inner conviction, and transformation. So there's all these forces that are at play. And now we've kind of said, let's put it all aside. Okay? And this is, IFS is a different language. All right. But it kind of goes into the same, vaguely the same notions. So long before IFS, and I've talked about this a little bit before, Ignatian spirituality, because I really like Ignatian spirituality, assumed that the human person, right, is not a single unified voice, but a field of inner movements, desires, fears, impulses, and consolations, some leading towards life and some away from it. So Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, who created Ignatian spirituality, invited people to notice these inner voices with curiosity and discernment. Okay, so he said it's kind of like, you have these different, you could call it spirits, right, that influence you. They're seeking to influence you, and some are more mature. And some are more immature, right? And what Ignatian spirituality urges you to do is the serve, right? It urges you to, and I think this is where it kind of overlaps with capital S self. It says you have to choose who you listen to. Do you listen to the more mature or the less mature spirits within you? Okay, so it's very similar to IFS. Jungian psychology carried a similar insight. Jung saw the psyche not as one unified self, but as a living system made up of different inner figures and forces, such as archetypes and complexes, each with its own influence on our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. So that's where you get into the collective unconscious, right? Jung's collective unconscious. These are not just forces that affect me, they're forces that affect all of us. Because we're at that level, we're all kind of united. All right. So the takeaway from that is the idea of multiple minds appears in many traditions, not just in IFS. It has a long history. Ancient religions talked about inner spirits or forces. Jung talked about complexes and archetypes. Psychoanalysis, so even Freud talked about id, ego, superego, different parts of the mind. The trauma theory talks about, the emotional parts, different emotional parts, right? And complex PTSD. So this is not coming out of the blue. This has a long history, long tradition. So let's get more recent. That's a picture of Richard Schwartz. So in modern times, Freud thought of the psyche or mind as being influenced by three distinct entities, the id, ego, and superego. I'm not going to go into this for the sake of time, but there are other psychoanalysts that continued to develop that model. Now, I think Schwartz wasn't probably aware of these other people. And I think Schwartz framed it in a more user-friendly language. And these other psychoanalysts didn't have nearly the kind of exposure that Schwartz has had. And Schwartz has been much more popular. He's been working for 40 years on this stuff, but it's really like the last 10 years that he's really broken through. But there are antecedents. He might have come up with it himself, but other people were heading in that direction. So Richard Schwartz is an American psychologist and family therapist. He popularized this multiple part approach to understanding the mind and called it internal family systems. This approach is in many ways like ancient mythologies. So in the next 10 minutes, before we go to questions, let me start to give you an overview of IFS. Like other approaches before it, CBT, DBT, EMDR, etc., IFS is today having its moment in the limelight. It's become, I think, but what's your sense about that? Isn't it kind of really mushrooming that it's everywhere, pretty much? Yeah. Everybody's discovering it. Yeah, it's interesting. So Richard Schwartz, who popularized the approach, was inspired to start thinking in this way as he worked with patients suffering from eating disorders. He was a family therapist. He was working in families, but he was also seeing these people who had eating disorders. And he often heard them say, a part of me thinks, feels, or wants X, but another part thinks, feels, or wants Y. Okay. Now, his brilliance was that, I've heard that from the beginning of my career, but I didn't make anything of it. But his brilliance was that, oh, let me go with this. Let me be curious about it. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Do you want to come closer because the microphone's here?
He was actually trying to prove family systems therapy, so different than internal family systems therapy, where you would rearrange members of the family and adjust roles, and that would solve the problem. And so he was set out to prove that in his doctorate. But then as he did that and did it like perfectly, he found the clients would still binge and purge. So he kind of got overwhelmed and frustrated, and then just listened to his clients and was able to get curious about those parts. So it was very kind of instructed to him and less of him kind of coming up with something new. It was very much more of a listening and giving and using others' language and kind of packaging that
Yeah.
together.
So you kind of internalize, you was using that model in the family therapy, and you kind of say, well, let's apply that, assuming there's this internal family.
Yeah,
within
some of
it.
the
Yeah.
dynamics a little bit
Yeah.
later, but just discovering of parts and self. And starting with that work was
Yeah.
very much kind of led by clients and patients when he was like, this other stuff isn't working when I'm trying to force or do something.
Yeah.
It's only when he got curious and loud parts to explain their role kind of completely
Well,
that he was kind of able to get anywhere.
great, thank you. Okay. So, IFS sees everyone's mind as consisting of discrete sub-personalities or parts. The difference between a psychologically healthy person and one that struggles psychologically is that the former, people who are more psychologically healthy, parts are unburdened. So everybody has parts, but if you're more psychologically healthy, they're not carrying burdens, they're not carrying pain, they're not carrying trauma. Whereas in the latter, people who more have psychological issues, their parts are burdened with this pain. Parts become burdened by painful experiences or as survival adaptations in people with insecure attachment and or trauma. Many burden parts arise in infancy and childhood, but burden parts can also develop later in life. Right? So that's a little bit of an overview. According to IFS, at a person's core is the true self, a concept that is somewhat like wise mind, but different, right? As we talked about it. The true self, much like wise mind, and this is another model that we won't go into, but it's an interesting model. Daniel P. Brown's ideal parent, right? It's very similar. And Daniel Brown uses kind of thinking of the ideal parent as reparenting us. So the true self is compassionate, creative, connected, confident, calm, curious, courageous, clear. So that's what Schwartz calls the 8 C's. And then there's also the 5 P's. These are all qualities of the true self, or the capital S self. And the 5 P's are persistent, playful, patient, and has perspective. So that illustration, that little thing there, summarizes the 8 C's and the 5 P's for you. That's like true self. Pretty cool, eh? Different burden internal family parts may be in conflict with and fighting each other. So it's like if you're healthier psychologically, your internal family is actually like pretty harmonious. Everybody gets along, right? But more psychological issues you have, parts are kind of fighting each other, and they disagree on many things. When this happens, self may be hard to hear above all this noisy commotion and conflict. So we all have self within us, but when parts are fighting with each other and they can be so loud and their burdens are so heavy, right, that you don't hear self at all. Right? It's very faint. Which reminds me, I used to go for silent retreats in Guelph at the Jesuit retreat center there. And one of the first things they said is very similar to this. They said, God speaks to everybody, but he speaks very quietly. So you have to be very silent to hear it, right? You have to quieten, not just like outer silence, like silent retreats, but all the noise of distractions from everyday life. And also you have to silence what goes on in your head, all the dialogue. And that's what they said. Like if you can quiet down, then you hear, the self, or in Jesuit terms, they call it God. Each internal family part has its own feelings, perspective, interests, memories, viewpoints, and will to survive. They really see themselves as separate individuals within you. Each part has an origin story, started somewhere, in the individual's life and is an adaptation needed to survive the circumstances at that time. Individual parts may not be aware that they are a part of a greater whole. They may feel like, that's all I am. Sometimes they are not aware of each other. So let's continue our overview. At various points in time, different parts may become dominant in the self system. So they have, sometimes they kind of go into the background, they're quieter. Other times they take up a lot of space, right? And then if they take up a lot of space, you become what's called blended. You feel what they feel, you think what they think, you do what they want to do, right? And then sometime later, they may kind of like retreat into the background. And then there's another part of you that comes to the fore. And that's like, oh, what was that? Why have I changed so much? What was that? Right? That wasn't me. When a part dominates or takes over, the person is said to have become blended with that part. More than one part can be activated at the same time. It's not just one part at a time. You can have several kind of being activated together. Parts that are activated at the same time interact with one another, often in conflict, but sometimes as allies. Being emotional, because these parts are emotional, they're not rational. Parts don't have the rational brain's ability to distinguish one person from another or the past from the present. Okay? They're in trauma time. They don't know chronology. Okay? They don't know today is different from yesterday. This happened like 5 years ago. They think, they're frozen in that time. They are what is called frozen in time. That is why people react emotionally to someone in the present as if they were someone from their past. Okay. The goal of IFS is to bring harmony to the internal family as the parts learn to trust the real self, wise mind, ideal parent, which sees and empathizes with all of them. Okay, so real self, it's superpower, just a little bit like wise mind, because wise mind can see your feelings and can see your rational mind, and then can kind of make better decisions. Difference with capital S self or the real self, it can see all your parts, and it likes all of them, right? Empathizes and it understands. And parts really like that. They're very calm, as they would be by an ideal parent. Like, because that's like, in a way, it's a secure relationship, secure relating, right? All right. Trusting wise mind parts, trusting, I'm mixing my language here, trusting capital S self or real self, parts then allow it to lead the internal family system. And I think that's what healing is that it's not like parts go away, but parts get soothed and they still come up. But then, because, that capital S self is this ideal parent-like presence, it steps in and says, I see you. You don't have to react. You don't have to take over. Let me do it, right? And it turns out a lot better. Right? So just get in the last 5 minutes before we go to our questions, just introduce this because this is less we'll have to do next time. So we'll have time for other stuff. So there's 4 types of parts. I'm not sure I'm going to get through all 4 types of parts today, but let's start. So one type of parts are called exiles. So exiles are typically young, vulnerable parts that have experienced distress and or trauma. Because exiles carry so much pain, which the person feels when they emerge into awareness, they are isolated or exiled from the conscious mind for their own and the mind's protection. They're called exiles because they're kind of in the basement. They're like in prison. Right? And why are they in prison? Because when they come to the surface, they bring their pain with it. And we don't want that. Or our small s self doesn't want that. And so we kind of push them back down into prison. Exiles constantly seek to be heard and validated and often resort to extreme measures in their efforts to try to escape the silence they are condemned to in their prison or exile. Exiles live in trauma time in that they are frozen in the past when the trauma occurred, and their identity is the trauma. When exiles escape from their confinement, because they're always trying to escape, that's what prisoners do, and emerge into consciousness, the person re-experiences the emotions and sensations that occurred at the time of the trauma or the attachment stuff that went on. Exiles can appear as flashbacks or nightmares. These are the burdens or pain of past traumas. Right? Exiles sometimes reenact the original trauma by seeking out and being in relationship with someone who resembles an abusive caregiver or partner from the past. They seek what is familiar. This is their attempt at a redo. They try to fix the past and escape their trauma by getting into a situation similar to the one that traumatized them, hoping that this time the outcome will be different and they will be seen, heard, understood, responded to appropriately, taken care of, and saved. Okay, so they're kind of trying, they're looking to be saved by someone, right? Someone's out there, right? That's what they want. They want to be, their pain to be soothed, to be rid of their pain. They want, they will fix, so what this exiles will do, they will fix an abusive partner with their love or control, and this is like the whole system, not just the exiles, and then get from them the love and appreciation they never got from an abusive parent. So this whole system, sometimes what we seek to do is, and this is why sometimes people reenact or repeat same kind of relationship, abusive relationship they had earlier on in their life, because it's like an attempt at a redo. And the fantasy is, this time, it'll be different and it'll fix my pain. All right. So talked about exiles, and we'll spend a lot of time when we get into the workbook, we'll spend a lot of time getting more familiar with exiles. So then there's two other parts. They're called protectors. And protectors include managers and firefighters. Okay? Because why are they called protectors? They're protecting the small s self from pain. Their goal is to protect you, try to protect you from pain. But sometimes they end up causing more pain. So two types of parts are charged by the small s self system with protecting it from the pain of past trauma and attachment issues carried by the exiles. And these are the managers and the firefighters. So I think I'm just going to talk about managers and firefighters, like two more slides, and then we'll go to questions, okay? And we'll leave the rest for next time. So the role of both the managers and firefighters is to keep the exiles imprisoned or safely in exile so that they don't overwhelm the conscious mind with their pain. Protectors may use different defense strategies, such as intellectualizing, denial, distraction, criticism, and control to accomplish this. We'll get into that a lot, so don't worry about trying to understand all of that. Managers are proactive and tend to be socially approved. So one type, managers are like friendlier, firefighters are reactive, and they're often not very welcomed by other parts. And this is, I think, where I'll end, because I think after that, we're going to get into more nitty-gritty detail about managers and firefighters. So just to sum up, managers are the frontline staff working day in and day out to keep the exiles contained, right? So they're kind of like your regular prison guards, right? However, if there's like a riot, you have to call in the SWAT team. So managers are just the friendlier, nicer prison guards. The firefighters, they're only called in when the exiles have overwhelmed the friendlier prison guards or managers who can no longer contain them in the usual manner. So that's the SWAT team. And SWAT teams, can cause a lot of damage. And so that's where I'm going to leave it for today. And we'll pick up there next time and go more into detail. I'm going to give you an overview next time of internal family systems. We'll talk also about ways to begin to try to find your parts, because we're going to spend a lot of time on that when we get into the workbook. But see, like there's something called trailheads. So this is where, you know, the models from other so the concepts from other models, like biological psychiatry. So for example, if you have depression, or if you have anxiety, or if you have an attachment issue, those can be trailheads, ways of helping you to identify your parts. We'll get into that next time. Okay, let's leave it at that for now. And let's go to the questions. Sorry? Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
I'll stop recording.
Oh, yes, please, stop recording.